And we're live. It is Wednesday, September 16th, 2020, 5 o'clock p.m. We are starting on time today. Why are we starting on time? Because our guest showed up on time. Mai El-Sadany is not the sort of person who is late to a meeting, though I was very late to a meeting with her the other day. We are on time because the technology gods have smiled upon us, all of them. The YouTube god smiled. It was probably because of the sacrifice I made earlier today. The Facebook streaming gods have smiled. The Twitter gods have smiled. And the Crowdcast gods have smiled. There is exactly one god that did not smile on me today, which was the god of putting together fast tweets, to whom I didn't make a sacrifice, apparently. And the result is that I confused the YouTube link with the Crowdcast link. So if some of you who are normally on YouTube show up on Crowdcast, good, because that means we'll meet some new people. If some people who normally watch us on Crowdcast check us out on YouTube, check out how gross the chat is on the YouTube side compared to our awesome, lovely conversation that we have here. No, we are not allowed to have fun anymore. But in lieu of fun, we are allowed to have Mai El-Sadany of TIMEP, otherwise known as the Tahrir Institute for Middle East Policy. Mai is a human rights lawyer, a good friend, sometime lawfare writer. What else? What are the other things we attach to Mai's name? Oh, an awesome Twitter presence who finds all kinds of interesting stuff from people doing interesting things all over the world, particularly in the Middle East. But I find her Twitter presence really excellent. Mai, welcome to the show.
Thanks for having me, and it's nice to meet you, Kate.
It's really nice to meet you too. I'm excited for this conversation. I have no idea what you work on and what's going on. So I would just love it if you could kind of kick us off with how you know Ben, and then also kind of what you're working on right now.
Sure. Well, I think I know Ben via lawfare, but also via his fabulous wife, Tammy. So shout out to her. I wear two hats at TIMEP. I'm the legal and judicial director, and I'm the managing director as well. TIMEP was really created as a disruptor, officially in 2013, but inspired by protests that were happening in the Arab world, to make sure that there were no conversations happening about the Arab world without Arabs in them. We believe that policy is more ethical and effective when the folks on the ground who see what's happening actually play a part and parcel in the policymaking process. And so over the last 7 years, we've changed, but we've always stuck true to that. And it's something I'm particularly proud of. I'm Egyptian myself, so always love the opportunity to work with and amplify the remarkable work of folks on the ground. And then with my legal hat, I'm, as Ben said, a human rights lawyer. So I work particularly with human rights lawyers on the ground who are under attack all the time across the region because they're this last line of defense. They're protecting all the other human rights defenders, all the other journalists, civil society activists, what have you. And so there's a lot of need to support them, to support their work, to make sure that they're part and parcel of the policy conversation, but they also have access to international legal mechanisms.
So you told me something the other day that really alarmed me that I had not heard before, which was that lawyers in Egypt are increasingly the subject of arrest. And I've known for a long time that there's a kind of war on human rights activists in Egypt. That's nothing new, and we'll get to that. But tell us about the just kind of pattern of arrest regarding practicing lawyers.
Sure. Yeah, it's a very alarming development, and I would say it's relatively new. You hear a lot about civil society activists, human rights defenders, journalists being arrested, but often lawyers are left out of that conversation. But it seems that authorities have figured out that lawyers play this really important role in society. They protect all the other folks I just mentioned. They also challenge legislation in court, and they're often the ones who are leading reform initiatives. They understand what's broken in the system, and so they're the best folks to fix it, at least from a legal, institutional, and judicial perspective. And so we're seeing that lawyers are being increasingly attacked directly for their work. We've had cases in Egypt where lawyers are actually in the prosecution representing someone, and then they get arrested as well, which is an insane example. But then you also have the examples of lawyers who might be reporting on what's happening on their Facebook profiles or on their Twitter accounts, and they get arrested for that content as well. And you see them being accused of these crazy accusations, things like spreading false news, belonging to a terrorist organization, never once being told what organization that is. And this is just a pattern where you're seeing these arrests clearly for the work that's being done, often work that's perceived as either protecting dissidents or protecting people that the government doesn't agree with. And then you have them, oftentimes lawyers are forcibly disappeared for a few days before they themselves finally appear before this security body called the State Security Prosecution. They're levied with these charges, and then they're entered into pretrial detention. And one quirky and unfortunately upsetting thing about Egypt is that domestic pretrial detention periods can be up to 2 years. So you could be in pretrial detention for up to 2 years without ever being referred to trial.
2 years?
2 years, yeah. So that just, so you're increasingly having lawyers who are kept in for this long, right? Which means that they're like less likely to be able to represent other people, that they're less likely to contribute to legal reform. You're really cutting off the last line of defense. Exactly. Yeah.
And how clear are these all lawyers who are representing unpopular people, or is some of it just lawyers by way of warning other lawyers not to take on? Like, what links together the lawyers who are being detained?
Many of the lawyers who are being detained are what we would think of as human rights lawyers. So they're protecting other human rights defenders. But really, it's people who are journalists, are civil society activists, have established NGOs, are other lawyers. So really not people we would consider controversial in our configuration of things.
But this 2 years, like this 2 years of potential, how often does it actually stretch that long? And then also why is there not reform around that? It would seem
it is a dictatorship, Gabe.
Well, I mean, I know that, but you do have human rights lawyers there, and you have people who are there's something there has been revolution. I don't know, it just kind of seems to me like that is why bother with the rule of law once you're at that point, I guess, is if they say 2 years, then who the hell cares, I guess. Sorry, not to get super dark.
No, to be honest, one of the things that's particularly alarming about this whole arrest of lawyers is that there's actually a significant attempt by Egyptian authorities to use and weaponize the rule of law. So they passed legislation that allows for this thing to happen, which actually then justifies the practice in the first place, right? It's one thing to keep someone in pretrial detention for an egregious amount of time if the law doesn't allow it. It's another thing to change the law to allow that to happen, and then to say, hey, international community, don't bother me. This is what my domestic law says. And so I think that's what really worries me. And it's the same thing that we're seeing when it comes to passing legislation prohibiting or restricting the right to protest, to establish NGOs, cyberspace. All of the Egyptian government is embarking on this project of consolidating its authoritarianism via the law, which makes it that much more scary. Because when you talk about rule of law, what does that actually mean when the government is technically respecting its own law, albeit in violation, by the way, of its constitution and its international legal obligations? But that then becomes a case of legal arguments, right, that are too technical for most people to follow.
Can I ask a quick question? So this is just where you were at Georgetown Law School. So I was too. Were we there at the same time? Possibly. I don't know. I graduated in 2012.
No, I think I just missed you. I started in 2012. So.
Okay. Yeah. Cool.
So,
sorry.
it wasn't that long ago that Egypt was a very exciting place from the point of view of emergent rule of law, emergent democratic government. Um, Without going into the whole like what happened to the Arab Spring, which is a whole different question, um, how like give us an overview of the degree to which the human rights situation has degraded under Sisi. It's gotten really bad, and like I don't. The political sociology of how we got from here to there is less important right now, from my point of view, than just accounting for what the situation is today. But describe the situation today.
Sure. I mean, building off of what I was saying to Kate earlier, you have this consolidation of authoritarianism using rule of law, which means a lot of legislation implicating rights and freedoms. So things like a protest law, an NGO law, a cybercrime law, a media law, all of which create more and more mechanisms through which to prosecute people's behavior. You have a closing civic space, both as a result of law, but also because NGOs are being targeted and have been targeted. I mean, you had the infamous case 173, which actually involved NED, NDI, a lot of these US-based organizations that probably many people in the audience had heard of. That case continues today. And the first phase of the case, although everyone in that phase was acquitted, thanks in part to US, the case remains open for the second phase. And so in the second phase, Egyptian NGO workers are being brought in for questioning, are being put on travel ban notices. And you'd think that with the first case, everyone acquitted and woohoo, success, that part of the case would be closed. But unfortunately, it remains open. And that's just indicative, I think, of the civil society space. You have an environment where it's very difficult, if not impossible, to protest because protesters are arrested. And when protests happen, they're followed by weeks of systematic arrest campaigns of people being stopped in the street to ask what's on their phone, to be questioned, what have you. Rising number of arrests, but even in the arrests themselves, you have this trend of enforced disappearances where it's unclear to people where their loved ones might be held for days and at times months before they appear before something called the state security prosecution, which is a branch of the prosecution focused on state security, national security crimes, if you will. That in and of itself, the national security terminology, I would say, has been expanded and abused. So things like posting, give you a recent example, doctors who posted about PPE shortages were arrested for spreading false news in Egypt. And some of them remain in pretrial detention today. So you're just seeing ultimately this closing space for not just political dissent, I would say different ideas. Anything that's really, you've seen artists arrested as well. And in fact, we recently had an artist die in detention who had been kept beyond his pretrial detention period, and he was young in his 20s and should have been released, shouldn't have even been arrested in the first place. So effectively, if I would sum it up in one word, it's really this closing space for what's different.
So one of the things that's always puzzled me about it is it started, and frankly, I think the reason it bothered so few people in the United States, it started as a crackdown on the Brotherhood. And I think there were a lot of people who basically said, yeah, it's awful, but it couldn't happen to a bunch of nicer people, right? And there was a kind of a tolerance of Sisi, a lot of which was spurred by the UAE, frankly, and just a sort of sense that, we don't necessarily approve of these tactics, but he's taking on the Islamists, right? But now it actually seems directed. It's completely undirected, as best as I can tell. It's a lot of it seems to be directed at liberals. A lot of it seems to be directed at journalists. A lot of it seems to be directed at human rights oriented people. And so I'm interested in your sense of this metastasis. Was it never really about the Brotherhood, or was it just that authoritarianism and this sort of crackdown never stays constrained.
I think it started there. That's for sure. While the Brotherhood was in power, there were a number of human rights violations. There were a number of concerns, and so that paved the way for people to be, for many people to be unhappy, particularly in the wake of a revolution that had promised so much more. But I think what we're seeing is that was just a temporary period, right? The crackdown on the Brotherhood quickly and exponentially expanded well beyond that. Like you said rightly in your question, the vast majority of folks that I'm talking about are people who couldn't be farther from the Brotherhood.
Right.
They are liberals, they are seculars, they're at times leftists and atheists and people who you would never put into that category, right? And the fact there have been Christians in Egypt who've been accused of belonging to a terrorist organization. So the fact that prosecuted under the counterterrorism law. So the fact that while that may have been the starting point, and while there may have been initial understanding, if you will, based on the political context of why that happened, the fact is it quickly grew from there. And now I think one would be remiss to say that this is about the Brotherhood or about anything else. It's just about this space for dissent.
Kate? Wait, you're muted. I think you have to unmute yourself. You can't? Kate has been silenced. I will pose a question while bringing Kate back in. So there have been a number of particularly celebrated cases that have kind of broken through to some kind of larger public consciousness. First of all, for those who haven't followed this stuff, what are these, which are these cases that have been particularly high profile? And secondly, what separates them from the more general environment that is itself? I mean, they all seem to me to be representative of a class rather than singular in and of themselves. I'm interested for your thoughts on it.
I think there's a lot of different things going on. A lot of the names that we may be familiar with when it comes to individuals who've been prosecuted or faced reprisal for their human rights work maybe have a long history of work in the space. NGOs around the world are maybe familiar with their work, so they know them. I'll give you the example of Ala Abdel Fattah, who's an activist, Egyptian activist, whose family has long been faced the worst kinds of reprisal for their work, from his father, who was a human rights lawyer who trained many of the lawyers that we have today, to his mother, to his sisters and himself. He's been in detention for under every administration that he's been since Mubarak. And so I think that you have cases like these of recurrence, people who really get under the skin of the regime, I would say, because they're effective in their work, they're influential, they stand for principles that make it that much more difficult for the government to criticize them and critique them. And I think that's a little bit of a natural progression, but I think one of the things we try to do as human rights advocates is to tell the stories of people. So naturally, there will be names that make it to the headlines and names that make it to our Twitter accounts and what have you. But the hope is that we would be able to tell the story that this is one individual, but there are so many other journalists like him, or lawyers like him, or advocates like him. And I think this is something that all of us as human rights advocates struggle with, right? You want to tell the story, because when you tell the story and show a picture, someone will empathize with that and see their own mother or daughter or father in the picture that you just shared. But at the same time, you don't want to forget all the forgotten individuals, and increasingly that's becoming really high numbers, right? You have estimates of 60,000 political prisoners in Egypt, and those are old numbers from a few years back. I imagine with this new trend of pretrial detention and people forcibly disappeared, those numbers are higher.
Okay, I'm unsilenced. Man,
Kate is liberated now. She's unleashed.
So I'm also very happy to see a dog shirt, Ben. I wanted to
It
like
is a
comment on
dog
that.
shirt day.
I'm glad.
Let
I'm
me,
so
while
glad.
you're
It's been a
talking, I
while.
will display the dog shirt.
Oh,
There we
look.
go.
There's like the full dog shirt.
It is a dog shirt sort
I
of day.
I love a dog shirt sort of day. I was going to say that like one of the things that I work in social media and online speech and everything else, one of the things that has really taken hold in the last, I don't know, 10 years, but even before really like the debate really got going about like content moderation and everything else was like the Arab Spring and the role that like social media played in Egypt and in the Arab Spring. And there have been a couple of like very poignant pieces that have like come out since then that have said like, listen, this really wasn't about a social media revolution. This really wasn't about the internet. Like this was just about like, or rather like the internet wasn't as great as like we thought. Like it provided this flash pan and then that was it. Like that was like kind of, that was all we got. And like, then we couldn't like do something more. And I'm kind of interested to hear what your thoughts are on that. I feel like you would have like a really good sense of like whether or not like these like social media was a progressive in whatever sense that means, but like I guess progressive towards a system of democracy and law and order and transparency.
I think it's a bit of both, Kate. I think you have social media is an extremely useful tool. It's a mobilizer. It's a way to equalize the playing field. It's a way to share information. Certainly, it played a tool in bringing people together, but it wasn't the reason that the revolution took place, right? People power is the reason the revolution took place. And in fact, when the internet was shut down, people continued to come to the streets and continued to mobilize. And I think the thing, we can't say that it's not important and we can't say that it's the determinative factor. I think it continues to be an important space as evidenced by the fact that the regime is passing things like cybercrime laws to regulate that space, or that people are being prosecuted for their Facebook posts and their Twitter posts. That means those posts have the potential to influence others, right? They have this equalizing playing field, if you will. It's no longer a state television channel that has a control on information, a monopoly on information. I can go into my Twitter account and say, hey, I heard about this person being arrested. Maybe that was never covered on state media, but now everyone who follows me, retweets me, etc., knows that information, right? So it's played an instrumental role, I would say, in information sharing. It's also played an important role in making equalizing the playing field, which I've said before, making people shedding light on maybe smaller initiatives, organizations, people who get less attention or who might get less attention. It's created a place for people to organize, to think through ideas, to debate. But that being said, it hasn't been perfect as well, right? Content moderation, I could talk about this separately, but content moderation is not perfect.
Talk
in Arabic.
Talk. Like,
yeah, so Kate,
it's
the thing you have to know about Kate is that she is the world's leading expert on content moderation. And so like having like
all the time.
Like don't shy away from the subject of content moderation.
So like I would love like so I know for instance that like Facebook, Twitter, like employ a certain number of Aramaic like and like Arabic speakers like across to be clear, across their time zones. So like they have to do content moderation in real time. And so they are like employing people that can like do that type of content moderation in the same time zone as most reports are happening. And so I'd be really like thrilled to know like what you think like they're getting wrong, because there is a very large chance that like a lot of what people in the Middle East, North America region are getting flagged for is stuff that's also being reviewed by people in India because of their close proximity and cheap availability of labor, without any type of understanding of various like language and like other things. And so like I just think that that's as we kind of enter this completely global world, like I think that is like a very, like we should have more transparency about like no one knows if it's happening. Like I feel like most people don't understand, and I'm thrilled that you're talking about it right now.
I have to say, just before I delve into this and dig myself in deeper, Time Up does have a fellow who works on content moderation and information controls in the MENA region, Joey Shea. You guys should look her up. She's awesome. I am not an expert. I know what I know from learning from her and learning from my colleagues. But I will say there are a few issues. One, language. Arabic is a complicated language with multiple dialects. So even if you get Arabic content moderators, it may not be that someone who speaks Moroccan would necessarily understand someone who speaks the Gulf dialects. And there are multiple within those as well. So that's one big thing. I would say context is key. Understanding a political movement, a social environment, what words may be offensive to some people versus others. We're seeing a lot of content moderation when it comes to hate speech or political language being taken off. Sometimes I don't know who the content moderators are, and I think you'll also find that there isn't an exact number of publicly known number of Arabic content moderators that has been provided by either company. So even not knowing that, not knowing where they live, what their backgrounds are, if they're third-party content moderators, what their political motivators are, all of these are big questions. And I think they have, speaking to activists who have had their accounts frozen or their posts taken down for things that might be mundane or not offensive to others, or a certain political opinion as opposed to another, I think that shows that there are issues in the system. I can't say that I know exactly what, but
no, you're exactly right. Like, I think that there are issues in the system, and I don't mean to like kind of like, I'm trying to kind of highlight the fact that there are issues in the system. And like 5 years ago, I was talking about these issues in the system and people had no idea what I was even talking about. Like even talking about the idea that like Facebook and Twitter and whatever else took down certain content for X or like left up certain content for Y was like not a thing that like people like even understood. They were like, oh, I post something to Facebook and then just post it. And unless you'd had your stuff taken down, it was like not a thing. Yeah. And so like, I guess like mostly what I'm trying to say is that I think that like what you're saying is really valuable, but I also think that like it's not, the fight is not over. Like we have to keep having these conversations because otherwise people don't know when they're being censored or who is being censored.
Exactly.
And also like, I do think that we come from an American perspective with a certain amount of priors that are about free speech and then like we have a lot of privilege and a lot of kind of like very like really important ideas that are being talked about in the valence of like having free speech. But like we have not had to really truly like deal with an oppressive authoritarian regime in a very long time. And it's not to discount all of the conversations that are happening in America, which I think are important and at the valence of a lot of things. But like you talk to people in Hong Kong, you talk to people in Egypt, you talk to people in these other places, and they are dealing with free speech in a different way than like, oh, like Facebook took down my posts, or, you know, like, you know, they're not being locked up for their speech is basically what I'm saying.
Yeah, no, I absolutely agree. And that's not even, I think all of this is focusing maybe on the Egypt context, but it's not even getting into content moderation when it comes to documentation of human rights abuses. So Syria, Yemen, those contexts, we've seen YouTube and others take down videos that are essential evidence that could and would be used in court. So that's a whole nother set of issues as well.
And the weird thing that people do not understand about a lot of this is that like, and like Nicole Wong at Google, or like Daphne Keller at Google, or like AMAC at Alexander McElroy at Twitter would talk to you about, is like the way that those companies in the early days of the internet, before it was quite as widespread and before all this was happening, would go up against the governments of the companies to keep up certain types of posts, whether it was Thailand, whether it was Egypt, whether it was like Iran or Pakistan or like whatever it was. And there were all of these kinds of things happening, and they'll talk about it, and they really do believe that they did the right things and that they like kind of stood out on this outside. And then they feel like there is this call towards the like on the left in America, like that kind of, well, I don't want to speak for anyone, but like there is this movement towards like kind of having I don't know, like having a much more, and then like having a tech companies are bad and they are only bad and they have done nothing good for democracy on the other hand.
Yeah, no, I think that's simplistic too, right? There's a lot of good that's come out of social media companies, of access to the internet, of the ability to share information, to connect with people who you might have never connected with otherwise. Like, think of how many people we follow, even on Twitter or other social media accounts, and how much we learn from them. Just a lot of knowledge sharing, even evidence collection. Like I said, the record hasn't been perfect, but there's been a lot of important evidence collection that's happened on social media. So I think that it's a mixed bag. I think what I would tell social media companies is to continue to make individuals who work at these companies available for organizations, for advocates to engage with, to tell them what they think is wrong, to report on some of the violations or types of posts that are being taken down, and also to be a little bit more transparent on who's doing the content moderation, how they plan to improve, how they plan to grow some of their Arabic engagement as well. So I think there's a little bit of movement on both sides, but I think I think the fact that this is a conversation, like you're saying, and the fact that more and more people are thinking about this and thinking about how to improve these spaces is a positive step.
All right, we have a bunch of questions. The first two I want to take are both people who I have utterly failed to bring onto the screen. For, I think, entirely different reasons. So I will read them. Dina Abdallah writes, May, can you speak to the cases of the TikTok girls versus the Fairmont Nile rapes from a legal standpoint? So you're going to have to, for those of us who are not familiar with either or both of those cases, walk us through what the question is talking about. Dina also had a particularly thoughtful question in the chat that is lost in the mists of the previous chat. So while you're answering that question, I'm going to ask Dina to go and restate her earlier question, which I will read next.
Sure. It's like I planted Dina or something. I really wanted to talk about this, but I forgot. So thank you, Dina, for asking about this. So I'll start with the TikTok girls. Since April, at least 9 women, largely from working class backgrounds, have been arrested by Egyptian authorities for singing and dancing on TikTok. They've been accused of morality-related charges, accused of violating family values. 2 of those women have been sentenced to 2 years in prison as well as a fine, and a third woman has been sentenced to 3 years in prison as well as a fine. The appeals are currently ongoing, and they're actually happening with one appeal court date set for this weekend. So we're in the midst of this. But the fact that there have been prison sentences for regular exercise of speech, things that we would think of here as so mundane, so acceptable, so regular, just a regular creative form of expression, is a really problematic development, and something I think more people should be paying attention to. At the same time, when it comes to the Fairmont case, this is, you may have read on the news, you guys, that around news began to surface in the midst of sort of what was a Me Too movement, which I hate to use that framing because it's a very Egyptian movement of Egyptian women taking to social media, reporting on instances of sexual violence. And in the midst of this, it became clear that there was this horrific gang rape that had happened at the Fairmont Hotel in 2014, and that a number of sons of high-profile individuals were involved, potentially involved witnesses, and there seemed to be video evidence as well. And people began reporting on this on social media, and it took nearly the state a month, if not more, to finally issue a statement from the prosecution and ultimately arrest or call for the arrest, of the alleged perpetrators. At the same time, however, by the time they had actually acted, 7 of the perpetrators had fled the country because obviously it was receiving a lot of attention and the state failed to act quickly enough. And then they arrested 2. The most problematic, this whole thing is problematic, and it's shocking and harrowing and really upsetting, and has shed a lot of light on how little legal protections there are for women who want to report on sexual violence. But one of the things that's been quite problematic is that Egyptian authorities, in addition to arresting the 2 perpetrators, arrested 6 witnesses to the case and treated them as criminals, 3 of whom continue to remain in detention today. And one of whom, who was arrested and since released, is actually a U.S. citizen. And so this has just raised a number of issues. Obviously, you have this horrific instance of sexual violence and rape where there's video evidence, where there's multiple witnesses willing to come forward, to bravely come forward to talk about this. And instead of the state acting quickly, instead of the state arresting folks before they actually fled the country, and instead of the state working with these witnesses who obviously had been facing numerous threats and were scared to come forward, they arrest them and treat them as criminals and have similarly accused them of morality-related crimes as well. So I think stepping back from both of these incidents, you really see a situation where it's clear that the Egyptian state is unable and even unwilling to protect victims and witnesses of sexual violence, and in fact, often uses the excuse of morality prosecutions to control forms of expression and disproportionately targeting women in the process.
So Anne dug up Dina's earlier question, which involved the case of Mai El-Sadany, regarding what you're speaking about, which I think at the time was a reference to the arrest of lawyers.
Yes.
What do we know about that case?
Mai El-Sadany is a remarkable human rights lawyer who's faced arrest and prosecution reprisals before for her work. More recently, in September, she was at the state security prosecution representing another colleague, and she herself was arrested, taken into detention. She remains in pretrial detention today, and in an even more problematic development, has been ordered into pretrial detention in a second case. So in the off chance that she's ordered released in the first, she would remain detained. She's an extremely effective human rights lawyer, labor activist. She's had remarkable contributions in this space, and everyone respects her work and has learned from her. So to see this happen, not only as the crackdown on lawyers continues, but as this new tool of entering people into detention on multiple cases, even though the charges are the same and it's unclear what the violations even are, is an extremely problematic development. And unfortunately, it seems like a direction that we're going, because actually in the last few weeks, this whole phenomena of human rights defenders and lawyers being entered into detention in 2 different cases has begun to happen.
All right. Michael Fromberger, the floor is yours.
Let's see here. Can I unmute myself?
Yes, you're unmuted.
Oh, I'm not. There we go.
Exercising my plenary powers, I unmuted you.
Well, thank you. So earlier on, you talked about new restrictive laws being added around various issues in human rights. And I think I heard you say that there are at least some cases where these are actually contrary to the Constitution. And so, assuming that I heard that correctly, I'm curious to know, to what extent can the government be held to account for that, given the, sort of this authoritarian structure? And if so, who has the standing to do that without basically getting locked up for it? it sounds like a lot of people are being locked up for that. Or is there anyone actually that has that? And I mean, are we at a position now where it would essentially require some sort of revolutionary action?
Before we let May answer that question, we have to ask about the giant stuffed squid in the upper right.
Oh, yeah. So Sigrid, yeah, that's an octopus, actually.
It's an octopus.
Yeah,
So
I like octopus.
So I shouldn't call it squid pro quo.
Squid pro quo. Yes, no. Those are arms, no tentacles. I just like octopus, and this is
They're
one of the
very smart.
Yeah, they are. This is one of the unusual stuffed octopus toys that actually is somewhat biologically correct. They usually are very sort of cartoony looking, and so I got it. So.
Excellent.
The cat's
May.
Okay.
Love it.
Thank you, Michael, for your question. So Egypt has a constitutional court. So theoretically, if a law challenges or violates the constitution, lawyers can bring cases challenging them on the basis of constitutionality. There have been such cases in the past. In fact, Egypt has a history of strategic litigation, as we call it. However, because as part of this authoritarian consolidation, you're also seeing changes to the judiciary, you're seeing a closing, you're seeing more executive interference in the appointment of judges. And so it's become that much more difficult to expect your fair day in court, even if you do make it to the Supreme Constitutional Court. And the same challenge, I would say, exists. The risk that you raised of taking on high-profile cases to challenge things like the counterterrorism law or the cybercrime law or what have you could very well land you in prison. And so there's that factor, but certainly the larger factor is that we're also seeing this deterioration of the independence of the judiciary and this over-representation of security forces in the judicial and prosecutorial systems. So it's really difficult to be able to challenge legislation in court. And so in turn, you're seeing lawyers try to be a little bit creative. You're certainly seeing lawyers continue to try to challenge legislation anyway, to write legal memos just to establish awareness and to make the case. You're also seeing lawyers engage on the international level when it comes to engaging with the UN mechanisms, the African court, whenever that might be appropriate. You're also seeing advocacy around laws just to inform citizens what's going on, why this is problematic, why this violates the Constitution. So awareness building, but also engagement and dialogue. And you're certainly seeing lawyers put together alternative laws. Not that they would unfortunately be by the parliament, which has become a rubber stamp parliament, but you are still seeing people resist anyway. And I will say it's so remarkable to see people resist in the face of all of this horrible news that I shared with you, because it means that people believe in these principles, in these values, in the importance of the protection of human rights. These are authentically human values that everyone cares about, no matter where they're based and where they're from, and you have people fighting these fights. So as much as I can talk about how dire the situation is on and on and on, I also want to underscore the fact that there are so many remarkable change makers on the ground doing everything they can to fight in the little space that they still have.
Kate?
Yeah. So we have this great question from Charles Tho, who says, "Good evening, May. I am curious, what are the impediments, if any, to holding foreign intelligence officials responsible in U.S. courts for the extrajudicial killings or kidnapping of U.S. nationals overseas? I'm thinking of the Marie Colvin case where Syrian intel officials were tied to the killing of the Austrian Tice kidnapping case." And so, I'm interested in your thoughts about this, May. I'm going to let you go first, but I think that this is an interesting question. And moreover, I think that the interesting question is that we start holding people accountable in each other's courts for these types of killings. And that ends up being a mechanism in which we can kind of point towards democracy or other types of accountability. But I'm interested to hear what you have to say.
Sure. I won't feign to be an expert in U.S. human rights laws, though I'm trying to catch up on this issue. But I do know, for example, that Mohammed Sultan, who's a former Egyptian political detainee, who is a U.S. citizen, has filed a case on the basis of the TVPA. So that would be one of the first, I think, cases involving a U.S. citizen and an Egyptian official using this type of legislation. We'll see how it pans out. I would defer to him and others who are involved in the case to talk about the details, but if you do look him up, you would see a little bit about how that case is going. I think there is a space, and I'm not just talking about Egypt right now, I'll actually switch to talking a little bit more about Syria. I think there is a space for this concept of universal or extraterritorial jurisdiction, the idea that human rights abuses that happen in a particular country are so egregious that they should and can be prosecuted in other countries' courts. And Syria has sort of breathed life into this idea. The fact that impossible that you would see Assad regime officials being prosecuted inside Syria in this moment. And so Syrian lawyers and Syrian human rights defenders and folks who have been documenting for over 9 years have collected the evidence that they have and turned to Europe, which has a little bit more of a much more open, I would say, universal jurisdiction framework, which allows things like the first ever Syrian state torture case, which is being heard right now in Germany, in Koblenz, to be actually heard. And this is the first time that Syrians are getting to stand face to face with the person believed to be their torturer, to say exactly what happened to them, to hear from people like the grave diggers who dug the bodies of tortured detainees, to look into the eye of your torturer, just a really important space. I realize that case is not perfect. It will take time, but Germany is one of the most open universal jurisdiction legal frameworks. And I think it sends kind of a message that this is a direction we might be going, especially when things like the International Criminal Court, what have you, those might not be, they may not always be options depending on if a country is a party to the Rome Statute or if the UN Security Council is going to exercise its veto. And so because of the lack of justice options in the case of Syria, we had this creative tool really be built up. And I imagine that this will pave the door. It's already paving the door for other Syrian cases, but I imagine that it may similarly pave the door for other cases in the MENA, for violations that have occurred in the MENA region and around the world.
Tony Cava, the floor is yours.
Hey, how are you doing? May, thank you very much for this work.
How are the fires in your area, Tony?
The fires are far away, but the smoke is ever present, and it looks like it's going to be here for at least another week. And I've been going stir crazy because you're not really supposed to go outside. So it's tense over here, Ben. So, but not as tense. What's that?
It's tense everywhere, but
it's tense everywhere.
You guys are ground zero right now.
Yeah.
What's on your mind?
There's people who have it worse. Well, I was going to tweak my question just a little bit because I think you addressed some of it when you were talking with Michael. And what I'm curious are, what avenues are available to the common Egyptian to affect change given the nature of their current regime? And how does that compare, say, to the common Lebanese? And, how do they affect a change in just kind of corrupt governance to what avenues are available to the common Syrian, say? And in any of those cases, are the peaceful measures still available? And are they likely to be effective? And I've one more question after that, but it's okay if I don't get to it.
We'll keep you on, but let's let May address it. And this is a big enough question that let's keep it discreet for now.
Sure, no. I think the contexts are different, and depending on exactly where you sit and what positioning you may be in, you might have different opportunities to affect change. I think in the Egyptian context, obviously you have a crackdown that's very active. So it becomes that much more difficult to engage in public dissent. You're much less likely, for example, to see protests, but you continue to see people reporting despite the risk on social media, tweeting, posting on Facebook. You see people continue to work for civil society organizations, for human rights organizations, even though there is such a crackdown on those organizations and they risk arrest. You see people like Metastasis, which is an independent, one of the last remaining independent news organizations in Egypt, that continues to report, and that has faced raids even on its office, but that continues to work anyway. So there are people who continue to fight. It's just a closing space, and it's an active situation where unfortunately authorities are going after people in so many different contexts. So you don't always know what form of expression will land you in trouble, if you will. Like I said, with the example of the doctors reporting on PPE shortages earlier, you really have this expansive crackdown. In Lebanon, the situation is a little bit different because you have a history of government negligence, corruption. You don't have as much of an active crackdown in the way that Egypt is, but you do have problematic developments. For example, we were tracking press freedom violations since the October 2019 protests. Press are being called in for questioning. They're being accused of, based on what they're writing, what they're reporting on. When protests happened in the days following the Beirut blast, you had violence being used on the protesters and tear gas being used. So you have these incidents of active crackdown, but it's not as consistent, I would say. In the Lebanese case, there's been a lot of really interesting forms of mobilization. I'll give you an example that I'm biased towards because one of our fellows, Karim Shahaib, helped found it. But the Public Source is this independent media organization in Lebanon that encourages a culture of whistleblowing and actually is public interest journalism. So almost like a ProPublica, if you will. That's a great idea because if people have access to documents where that might provide information on government corruption or government negligence, what better way to share that with journalists who then encourage the use of things like a freedom of information law, which they have, by the way, and these tools. So there's a little bit more of an infrastructure to engage with government corruption, albeit it's a complex topic and often technical. So I leave it to organizations like the Public Source and others to explain why this matters. And I think the Beirut, for Lebanese activists and advocates who've been talking at length about why the root of many of these problems is corruption, the Beirut blast kind of underscores just how deadly corruption can be. And I think this has been a moment where advocates, and I feel for them because what happened is so extremely painful. The fact that they have to, in many cases, pick up their lives and move from their homes and what have you. But once the dust settles, for lack of a better phrase there, I think that you'll see more and more people are beginning to use the language about corruption, are beginning to talk about government negligence, are beginning to demand changes. You see people looking at the corruption laws that have been passed and saying this isn't enough, or this whistleblower law doesn't provide enough protection. So I think there's increased awareness there and a lot of space to engage. And then certainly with Syria, depends where you are, certainly. And it's important with Syria to recognize the fact that half of the population has been displaced. So a lot of Syrians are outside of the country and they're finding ways to resist in their own way, whether it's through documentation, whether it's through the bringing of cases like I was talking about earlier, whether it's through trainings. Inside Syria, unfortunately, in the Assad regime controlled area, we're seeing this reconsolidation of the space where it's extremely difficult to speak out. The few journalists that do exist, and we'll talk off the record to certain individuals, and so we have bits and pieces of information come out on what's happening, but there's really a big information gap there. And certainly the fact that hostilities continue in some places, but for the most part, we're seeing this reconsolidation of control, but it's by a war criminal. So the stakes are extremely high, and it's certainly not a context that allows for public discourse and public engagement, especially when we continue to see these horrific stories about mass graves, about detention facilities, what have you. So I think all of the countries are in such different places, but there continues to be little pockets for folks to engage and push back and really stand for what they believe. And here's to them for doing that. Honestly, one of the best with things that I'm most lucky and blessed to have is just the ability to work with so many remarkable folks on the ground. It really makes you check yourself and think what you're doing here, and really puts things into perspective, I would say.
Just to try to distill that to a brief and reductive summary, is it fair to say that in Lebanon you're relatively free to organize? The problem really is that the system is built to be non-responsive to whatever organization you engage in. So you can have whatever protests you want, but the risk is that they're really not going to make a difference, and the system just kind of chugs on. In Egypt, you organize at the risk of arbitrary arrest. In Syria, you organize at the risk of being murdered and having your family murdered. Is that a fair, if reductionist, account of it?
It's fair for the most part. I would say the only caveat about Lebanon is that as protests have increased, we have seen some problematic behavior that other countries bleed into, when it comes to like enforced disappearances of folks, people being denied access to lawyers, protests, use of tear gas, what have you. From a reductionist perspective, I'll give it to you though.
Okay, that's yeah. I didn't mean it. I meant it as a crude rubric.
Yeah.
We're running out of time, but Tony, pose your second question quickly, and then we'll go to Pat Gunn to finish up.
Oh, okay. Well, thank you very much. Just leaving aside the role of the U.S. government, because we haven't been helpful under either party in the past, what are some of the things that, I just want to be sure I get this right, what can we just kind of common folk Americans, maybe non-lawyers, et cetera, do to help Egyptians bring about democratic governance?
I think there are a few things. If you're American, the U.S. government gives a lot of aid to Egypt. So just asking that, questioning how that aid is being used, being comfortable raising human rights abuses to your government, to your representative, raising these cases, telling these stories, amplifying the work of folks on the ground to protect them, sharing about when you hear about these violations, but also demanding that our government in the U.S., when they have a relationship with the government, make sure they hold their allies to account, whether it's through things like aid conditionality, targeted human rights sanctions, public statements in support of democratic actors on the ground. There's a lot that we could be doing that we aren't doing in this administration.
Pat, the last question is yours, but we need an account of the stuffed cephalopod in back of you before you go.
What is with all of these stuffed cephalopods?
Yeah, like, this is like, is it
It
an
is a
octopus?
cephalopod, right? It looks like a
Yes.
squid.
Yeah, it's a squid. The American Museum of Natural History had one of these in a gift shop, and I saw one on just a little bit ago, and I thought it would be very funny to go and grab this from my bedroom.
Oh, perfect.
Excellent. I think you chose well. To anyone else out there who is contemplating being raptured in on In Lieu of Fun, stuffed cephalopods are always appropriate. Pat, you get the last question.
Ben, I actually had two questions, and I honed both of them a little bit. But which one of the
Throw
two
them
do you
both
think?
out there.
Okay.
Throw them both out there. We'll let May decide which one, if both to address, or both to address.
Okay, so one of them is because I've been reading Middle East Review for many years as a way to try and it's a foreign affairs journal, and I think it's published by MEI, and they talk a lot about Middle East culture and economics and law. And one of the things that I read about with them is there are occasionally articles that stress informal networks of favors and personal ties that are part of Middle Eastern and countries in the Maghreb, and they talk about it as being an essential but understated part of economic life in that area. And I'm wondering how that ties into corruption, and if it is seen as a problem from the corruption perspective, how should they be addressed directly into law? So that's one question if you want to go that way. The other question is, with many Muslim majority nations being based in or strongly inspired by Islamic law, do lawyers from those countries find having a good understanding of usul al-fiqh? Do they find that it gives them a greater, and apologies if I didn't pronounce that particularly well, do they find that it gives them a greater ability to follow legal developments across national borders? And if they find legal tactics that work in one place on human rights, how transferable are those arguments to other nations across a national border? Whichever of those two you want to tackle.
Sure. I can weigh in very quickly on the last. I am not an expert in Islamic law, but I can tell you that actually, fun fact, a lot of the countries with the most problematic legal systems in the region, like Egypt, Syria, have French legal systems. That's where the origin came from. So just an interesting tidbit there.
Louisiana.
The difference of I think what is most transferable, I would say, are tactics. So lawyers often talk to each other about different arguments or different ways to put together arguments that work in court. I don't know how much there is on that when it comes to Islamic law, which isn't formally incorporated in many of the countries that we're talking about that I'm focusing on. But certainly a question, I think, for a scholar of law and Islamic law, maybe someone who's not me. On the corruption question, very quickly, I think that what you may be referring to is a system of nepotism, perhaps an overrepresentation of certain parties in business dealings, at times in some countries an overrepresentation of the military in receiving certain contracts. So I think definitely civil military relations, military presence in the economy, tools to combat nepotism, all of these are part and parcel of the corruption conversation. I think that there's a lot of good organizations actually on the ground in many countries, including affiliated with Transparency International, that are doing some really remarkable work when it comes to corruption. So I won't feign to be an expert there, but I think certainly in some countries, I won't say all, there is a problem when it comes to unfair or non-transparent handing out or sharing of contracts, or the spoils, if you will. And certainly a big issue in Syria that we'll see play out in the next few years, unfortunately, as well as you see these reconstruction contracts play out.
We're going to leave it there. May, thank you so much for joining us. This has been a pleasure.
Thank you so much for having me, and thanks everyone for the questions.
This was unbelievable, May. You're brilliant and so thoughtful, and I hope you get to come on again. And I also hope that we get to talk again, in our other capacities that are not on In Lieu of Fun. But
let's talk about content moderation.
Oh my gosh, I will talk your ear off.
I look forward to
talk about it. Good.
Yeah. Okay, thanks, guys.
We will be back tomorrow, 22 hours and 57 minutes from now. And I believe our guest tomorrow is Biana Golodriga of CNN,
yes.
Foreign Affairs analyst. And until then, we don't have fun anymore. But unfortunately, we do have lawyers getting arrested in Egypt, and a lot of terrible things happening that we should, pay more attention to than we do. I hate to be a downer about it, but
it's a good thing to be. It's a good thing to be talking about, and we should talk about it more. So thank you for coming on, May. I really appreciate it.